Chapter 3. Jeff and I crept back into his apartment the next morning. We were both surprised to see the chair where my aunt had fallen asleep empty. She'd apparently gotten up at some point in the night and gone to her room. My mom came to pick me up not long after we got back, and I remember my palms being so sweaty I couldn't grip my water glass when she came in. My head felt awful, too. Part my first ever hangover, part my not sleeping at all. Something was off with my mother as well. My guess was she heard about the break-in at the funeral home, but wasn't telling me. We got into the car in silence, and she drove us home. I realized why she was giving me the silent treatment when we pulled up to our house. 3 cop cars were there, parked. 2 were black and whites, but one was all black. I said nothing as I marched in. At our kitchen table, sitting casually with a few papers spread out, were a couple of detectives and 2 other men in standard uniform. They were sharing coffee and stopped talking as I walked in. My mom pulled out one of the chairs, expecting me to sit, and I remember looking at that chair, and then at the detectives, and knowing that I was done for if I put myself in that chair. Not just that, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. Danny Fisker knew me, and nobody else would believe he existed until they found me with my throat torn out and devoured. I wanted to run out the door. Maybe I should have, but I sat. "I'm Harry, and this is Sal," said one of the detectives, a lean and tall man. "Why don't you tell us what happened last night?" I was silent for a few seconds. "I was at my cousin's house last night." "We know it was you," Sal said. He was a big man, and I couldn't help but stare at his huge, sausage-like fingers. "We talked with your mother about it. We found the spare key in the door. You're the only one who knows where the key to the morgue is, and it was unlocked. So we know it was you that unlocked both doors." "Yeah," Harry said. He gave me a big, fake smile. "We just want to know the details. The why." I didn't quite know what to say, so I tried to tell a half-lie. "I went there to see if Danny Fisker was real. He's supposed to come out at night." Sal gave me a funny look. "Danny what?" "Danny Fisker," said the uniformed police officer. He was a relatively young man, but his face had a slightly aged look when he spoke. "Little urban legend. A ghoul who lives at the funeral home and graveyard, eating ears and noses because he doesn't have any." Sal looked hard at me. "So who dared you to go in?" "Nobody," I said, thinking of Jeff and Mikey and John. Despite what they got me into, I wouldn't just let the police in on the whole thing. "Was it Jeffrey?" Harry said. "Did he make you do it?" "No," I said. "Then why? Did you let some stranger, some creep in?" "No, it wasn't a stranger." "Call in for Jeffrey," Harry said to the standing officer. I nearly jumped out of my seat, tears filling up my eyes quite suddenly. "No, not Jeff." Sal put his hands out. "Relax, son. We're not sending Jeffrey back to juvie, all right?" "No?" I asked, unable to stop the tears. Sal shook his head. "It's a welfare thing. I can't tell you more than that, but we're not going to jail him, all right? He's a kid." He nodded to the officer, who stepped away, talking into his radio. "So, tell us what happened," Harry said. "We just want to know what happened so we can close our investigation." I started crying, but I also started spilling my guts. I told them everything. I told them about the beer, about breaking in, about the horrible monster in the darkness, glaring at me hungrily. Danny Fisker? I couldn't say, but I couldn't talk about him without trembling. I was sure I was going to throw up. "You left after that," Sal said. "You didn't go back down to the morgue?" "No," I said. "Are you crazy? The morgue is where it lives." "None of you boys went into the morgue. Is that what you're telling me?" Harry said. I don't know. They had just found the door was already open when I saw Danny in the chair." Sal and Harry shared an incredulous look. "How long do you think you were at the top of the stairs?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe a minute?" Sal shook his head. "Come on, let's drop the ghost story. This older boy, John, is he the one who opened up the lockers?" "What?" I said. "What?" "He just saw the door was open." "Was it you that opened up the lockers?" "What? The lockers?" "Few of the lockers were opened up. The bodies were out," my mother said. "When I came down to investigate the break-in. Were you trying to see a naked woman?" "Let us handle this, please," Harry said. I was at a loss for words for a few seconds. "We didn't open up any lockers. We went there to see if Danny Fisker was real." You sure John didn't open up the lockers? Sal said. I stammered for a minute. I guess he could have, but he didn't. Jeff would have talked about it. He always talks about stuff like that. How big in trouble are we? I said timidly. Sal shrugged. Desecrating a body is pretty serious. We didn't do anything to the bodies. If anyone did it, it was Danny Fisker. He's there now. Did you catch him? You have to stop him. Calm down, son, Harry said. Listen, we're not arresting you. We're not even going to take you into custody, except to talk to a man a little later today. He's a psychologist. No handcuffs, none of that stuff. The police psychologist was a nice, middle-aged man with a close-cut beard. He made me tell the story again, but it was a little easier than the first time. When he was done, he walked out of the room and talked to my mom, along with Sal. On the way home, my mom finally broke the silence. Never thought you'd be capable of something like that. Like what? I said. Breaking into the home, and then lying like that. But it's not a lie. You have to believe me, it was real. My mom got agitated and growled to herself. That's what the shrink said, that you believed it was real. It was real, Mom, but... I paused and looked at the glaring face of my mother as she drove the car through heavy morning traffic. It was real, Mom, but I don't expect you to believe me. Kids can't be believed, and he knows it. Can't you think, for just once, about someone other than yourself? Mavis is going to have Jeffrey taken away from her, put into foster care. Doesn't that mean anything to you? What? That's what the police meant by welfare. If you would just tell the truth, that boy John made you take him to the funeral home and made you show him the dead bodies, none of this would be happening. But that's not the truth. My mom reached over like she was going to slap me. I shrank back. She seemed to think better of it and pulled her hand back. You're going to go into the shrink's office and you're going to tell him that you made the whole thing up to get attention. You're going to tell him John threatened you and Jeff, and it was all his idea, and he's the one who was messing with the bodies. But then you're going to tell it to the detectives, and if you don't, so help me God. She just grunted instead of completing the sentence. It was a terrifying moment, but also revealing, and I remember it still. Even my mother couldn't evoke the name of God with a lie. I hardened myself in that moment. If God existed, so did devils, and one of them lived in the funeral home. I had never been to church, but at that moment an understanding of faith and its inverse was born in my young mind. I was alone, and nobody would ever help me survive. A few agonizing days later, days filled with unwelcome and torturous dream sleep, my mom took me to see what I found out later was a court-appointed psychiatrist. He was a nice middle-aged fellow, as they all seemed to be, named Dr. Grant, calm and non-emotional as he talked to me. He was primarily a therapist, he informed me, not merely a doctor of psychotropic medicine. I was infinitely thankful when he asked my mother to leave the room, and she complied. He told me later that he legally can't make a parent leave, but people often will do what you ask of them without considering the option of saying no. He asked me about the creature, Danny Fisker, for a long time, playing out of me every detail of the foul thing. He asked about my feelings. We talked for a long time about my parents' divorce and how I felt about it. Things always came back to Danny Fisker, though. I'm worried about this vision of yours, he said. You said you see him at night. Is he the same at night as when you saw him at the funeral home? No, I said. He's not really there. It's just me imagining. But he's real at the funeral home. He was real. He was silent as he wrote something on a piece of paper. You don't believe me, I said. Actually, I do, in a way. I'm going to have your mother come in and talk to both of you about this, all right? Anything else you want to tell me before I do that? I nodded. She wanted me to lie so that Jeff wouldn't end up in foster care. Thank you for not lying. It's important for Jeff and for you. Don't ever be afraid to be honest here. That it? I nodded. All right. Dr. Grant got up from his desk and quietly retrieved my mother. He had her sit next to me, and she was silent and blank-faced as she spoke. So, let's talk about what I'm seeing here. Shouldn't Billy leave? My mom said. Dr. Grant shook his head. It's my philosophy that it is important for the patient to be party to any therapy or treatment, even if he's a child. He picked up his notebook and looked it over. There are some very interesting things going on here, dealing primarily with troubled individuals, particularly children. I have developed some good tools for detecting what we call psychological acting. That is, behavior that is designed to simulate some sort of psychological disorder. Some people can be very clever, and some psychiatrists are very excited about exotic disorders. I saw a slight smile form on my mother's face. Dr. Grant caught her eye. That, however, is not what I think is happening here. William mentioned this figure, Danny Fisker, as being undeniably real in certain locations, but of an uncertain reality in others. These uncertain encounters with the vision, which happen primarily in spaces where hallucinations are common, such as in the dark, close to sleep, are of particular note. Also of note is that William discounts these encounters as part of his imagination. So he knows he was all just dreaming this up, and he admits he was doing it for attention and to get out of trouble, my mother said. Dr. Grant frowned and looked away for a moment. Not exactly. I believe William. That is to say, I believe he is telling the truth as he experiences it. He really did see this figure. I believe firmly that he truthfully experienced seeing it. However, this figure defies logic and our normal assumptions of how the world works, so we have to look at some additional pieces of evidence. William admits a paranoia surrounding Danny Fisker, a preoccupation with it, and a continual feeling of being watched. He also admits that his mind is presenting ideas and images which are very real to him, but are not as tangible as actual sensory data. We call these feelings and images part of a delusion. Dr. Grant took a breath and said, "This is actually, in conjunction with the visions of Danny Fisker, a strong indicator of the acute stage of schizophrenia." "What?" my mom shouted, nearly getting out of her seat. "You think he's crazy? He's just a kid who got into a little trouble. He's just depressed, if anything." It was weird to hear her try to stick up for me. Dr. Grant held his hands out peacefully. "Please, let me explain. Schizophrenia is a psychological disorder that is actually more common than people realize, affecting about 1% of people in some capacity. Usually, first onset is mid-teens, so this case would be early onset, and this case would also be mild." Dr. Grant looked at me and took another shallow breath. "I believe you saw Danny Fisker, but I think the best explanation is that you suffered a period of psychosis, a mental break where you can no longer correctly assess reality, or where imagination and reality merge, due to specific stresses. Lots of people suffer psychic breaks. It's very common. Schizophrenic psychosis tends to focus on recurring delusions, those unwelcome imaginings of this monster, and thus they are often incredibly convincing. You are lucky, though, in that you are very smart and are able to correctly identify delusions. Most people who are affected by psychotic disorders have deficiencies in self-assessing delusions. At the same time, people who try to fake this sort of disorder usually try to present persistent psychosis." Dr. Grant looked at my mother. "That's the sort of schizophrenic patient you might see on Dateline or 60 Minutes, but that's not typical at all. William isn't doing that, and he also isn't suffering any sort of deficiencies that are usually associated with schizophrenia, which is very, very good." My mom was silent for a long time. Then she said, "So what causes it?" "The physiological cause is unknown. We know it by its symptoms primarily. We're also beginning to do neurological studies using special machines known as MRIs. They're kind of like X-rays or CAT scans, but show a lot more soft tissue detail. But we're a long way from knowing what's physically going on. Luckily, it's been a very studied condition for a very long time, and we have a variety of ways to treat the disorder both medically and via psychological therapy. Usually there are 3 phases or cycle stages to schizophrenia, and treatment varies depending on the individual and where they are at in that process. William at this moment is not suffering from any significant psychosis. That's in the past, but the paranoid delusions are still persistent. For this reason, I would say he is still in the acute stage. The stage prior to the onset of psychosis is called the prodromal stage, and it's usually missed with first onset. It's a ramping up of paranoia and other manic states. This moves into the acute stage, which is typified by mania and psychosis. After the acute stage comes the recovery stage, where the patient is able to properly contextualize the delusions and settle into stable mental functioning. I'm going to recommend a few things. First, a removal from the things which I believe are stressing William and triggering the psychosis. That means he needs to stay away from the funeral home. I know this is also outside my area, but I recommend he spend more nights, if not all of them, with his father as he suffers no paranoia in that environment. "I have custody," my mom said. "Gary is never home anyway." "It's a suggestion. I can't order it. Beyond that, I'm going to prescribe an antipsychotic medication. I want William to take it before bed. It has sedative effects early on, so it will encourage sleep. Bedtime is also when the delusions are most powerful, so it should begin to help him resolve the paranoia rather quickly. I'll reassess him in a few days, and then we could consider tapering off the antipsychotic and going to an antidepressant, or trying therapy to stabilize the mood. So you're putting me on drugs, I said. Medication, Dr. Grant said. Just temporarily. Like I said, many people recover from periods of psychosis. I absolutely expect you to as well. The first step is to reduce stress.